We were working on two machines, a little technical difficulties this morning, but I think we got it set up. But I would like to first thank the Society, Gail, and other speakers and attendees for helping make this happen, helping us all feel comfortable. This presentation is based on a paper I'm writing called The Virtues of Acknowledged Dependence as a Framework for Digital Accessibility, or an Enquiry into Digital Accessibility. And I study at the University of South Florida, and I also work in the American technology industry. So this topic sits at an interesting intersection between what I practice and what I study. And so my aim in the next 30 minutes is simple. I aim to present the practice of digital accessibility as a virtue ethical practice, as a discipline of acknowledged dependence in a MacIntyrean sense, as it belongs at the center of how we think about designing our technology. To begin this frame, let's look at a common myth that we tend to see. The myth of the autonomous user. So every industry has a myth that it doesn't know that it's telling. In technology design, ours is the myth of a standard user, a seemingly self-sufficient, independent agent, fully capable, fully able-bodied, for whom accessibility features are a corrective exception made on behalf of everyone else. We could illustrate this practically by a wheelchair ramp bolted onto a building that was designed without one. I want to borrow from Charles Taylor's language to frame this. Taylor argues that the self is never self-grounded, that, in his words, one cannot be a self on one's own, that we exist only in relation to our interlocutors. If this is correct, if agency is really dialogical, socially embedded, formed in relationship rather than prior to it, then the fully autonomous standard user isn't just an oversimplification of our varied human condition, it's philosophically incoherent. There's no such person to design for. That's the target of my argument, and I think MacIntyre's arguments, particularly in dependent rational animals, is very useful here for extending it. But before we discuss MacIntyre's arguments directly, I want to locate this argument on a map of disability studies already knows well. This is surrounding different models of disability, and we're going to discuss two, but this list is by no means comprehensive. It includes the medical model and the social model of disabilities. So the medical model treats disability as something located inside an individual's body, a deficit caused by a disorder, a disease, or trauma. Something medically wrong with the person to be fixed or cured. It's the model built into many of our legal frameworks, such as the ADA or the EAA, and they tend to define disability as a threshold of documented impairment. Next, we have the social model, and the social model relocates the problem. Disability in this model lives in the interaction between bodies and environments. As Dale Cruz puts it, society's barriers, physical, attitudinal, and communicative, are the real disabling factors, not individual differences. A wheelchair user isn't disabled by their wheels, but by the environment that disables them. In digital terms, this reframing does real work. An inaccessible website is a signal of a flawed website design, not a signal of a deficient or disabled user. That single move from something wrong with them, the person, to something wrong with what we built is where accessibility as a moral practice starts to take place and develop. So recent philosophy of disability sharpens that social model insight considerably. First, Rosemary Garland Thompson's concept of the misfit. A misfit occurs, she says, when the environment does not sustain the shape and function of the body that enters it. Fitting happens when a generic body enters a generic world, a world built in anticipation of bodies the dominant perspective treats as standard. And she reaches for a digital example herself. Someone whose body doesn't fit the configuration of a keyboard won't produce text the same way 10 nimble fingers do. Inequality on her account is an artifact of material configurations misfitting with bodies, not simply an artifact of prejudice. Second, a take from Elizabeth Barnes. She distinguishes bad difference views of disability, where disability would still be bad even in a perfectly accommodating world, from mere difference views, where disability makes you physically non-standard, but doesn't by itself make you worse off necessarily. Barnes defends the mere difference view. To be disabled is not to have a defective body, but a minority body. And crucially, she doesn't deny that disabled people are often worse off. She just locates that disadvantage in ableism, not in the disability itself. Third, I take from Anita Silvers, drawing on Alan Buchanan's work. Disability as a mismatch between an individual's abilities and the demands of a given task. Not a fixed diagnosis, but a relation. Reading glasses make hyperopia functionally irrelevant. A badly structured interface makes ordinary variation disabling. So putting these three threads together, and you get a clear conclusion. The barriers disabled users hit online are contingent artifacts of explicit design choices. Removing them isn't an act of charity, it is a matter of justice. Now I want to turn to the first of two moral errors that MacIntyre helps us name. The error that sits underneath the myth of the standard user in the first place. In Dependent Rational Animals, MacIntyre goes back to Aristotle's megalocycos, the great-souled man. Aristotle praises him as someone who is ashamed to receive benefits because conferring benefits is the mark of a superior, and receiving them the mark of an inferior. This is a man who remembers everything he's given and forgets everything he's received. MacIntyre doesn't read this as admirable. He calls it, quote, an illusion of self-sufficiency, end quote. And he means it as a diagnosis of a moral failure. Because in refusing to acknowledge what he's received, the megalocycos excludes himself from precisely the relationships in which the virtues of giving and receiving are learned in the first place. He's not above the community he serves, he's cut off from it. I would like to suggest that the standard user is the megalocycos' digital heir. Alternative text, ARIA labels, color contrast, captions, none of it registers to him because none of it is ever visible to him as something that he might need. He experiences the system as frictionless, and he mistakes his own invisibility to the system's dependencies for genuine agent independence. That's the illusion, and it's baked directly into how we design our products and experiences. The second error I would like to bring out runs in the opposite direction, and Anita Silvers names it precisely welfarism. It looks benevolent on the surface, moral virtue measured by how much you contribute to someone else's well-being, but Anita argues it's structurally paternalistic. Help givers get to choose how they help. Help takers often can't choose how they're helped without risk losing that help altogether. The result, in her own words, is that it becomes socially incumbent on the person being assisted to profess their incompetence, even where they may be more competent to the people assisting them. Compliant behavior becomes the price of good treatment. You can see the design analog immediately. When we categorize disabled users as permanently, essentially in deficit, accessibility risks becoming a concession granted by a benefactor to a beneficiary, rather than a structural norm. Acknowledged dependence, as I'm using the term in this presentation, refuses both errors at once. The megalocycos, refusal to receive, and welfarism's assignment of some people to perpetual neediness. Nobody stands above reception, nobody is filed away as permanently needy. This is the moral terrain, so now let's build the philosophical machinery underneath it. So part one, MacIntyre's framework. I want to spend the next few minutes in MacIntyre's Dependent Rational Animals directly because the argument of this lecture really depends on taking seriously what he means when he calls us dependent rational animals. MacIntyre opens by naming a habit of mind many of us fall into without noticing. He writes that we're invited, when we think of disability at all, to think of the disabled as them, as a separate class of people other than us, rather than ourselves as we have been, sometimes are now, and may well be in the future. His diagnosis is that this habit comes from a refusal to acknowledge the bodily dimensions of our experience, a belief that we're somehow exempt from what he calls the hazardous condition of mere animality. But we're not exempt. Vulnerability, childhood, illness, and decline are structural features of every human life, not some deviation from a so-called norm. So disability on MacIntyre's account isn't the mark of a separate class of people. It's an expectation that is woven in the arc of every human life. Mine, yours, everyone in this room, everyone at this conference, in some way, shape, or form. This reframing matters enormously for what comes next. So independence is an achievement of dependence. Here's where MacIntyre makes his most important move for this discussion. He argues that rational independence itself is produced by dependence and not opposed to it. We become independent practical reasoners, he writes, through participation in a set of relationships to particular others who give us what we need. And from the very outset, from our infancy, we are, in phrase, in debt. We receive as infants long before we're capable of reciprocating anything. So imagine yourself as a child in the arms of your parents. There's no way you could give back to them until you move out, and even then we're going to be indebted to them forever. I take from Eva Feder-Kate also, and she extends this with her concept of dulia, the idea that those who sustain dependent others must themselves be sustained. In digital terms, this maps directly onto the maintainers, the standards bodies, the accessibility specialists, software engineers, and web developers, the people doing the invisible labor that makes participation possible for everyone. They stand inside the same web of reciprocal obligation that Kate describes. There's a well-known and probably apocryphal story about Margaret Mead asked to name the earliest sign of human civilization. She's said to have pointed not to a tool or to a weapon, but a healed human femur, evidence that someone cared for an injured person long enough for the bone to mend, rather than leaving them behind. I bring it in as a parable, not a documented claim, but it captures MacIntyre's point exactly. The capacity to give and receive care isn't a late refinement of human life. It's one of the conditions that makes human life what it is. MacIntyre's argument reaches its sharpest point when he rejects the idea that there's a clean line separating human rationality from animal life. The idea that we're animals, and then in addition something else entirely. Against that picture, he insists, what we become through language and reflection are redirected and remade animals, not something categorically different. We remain, in his words, animals' selves with animal identities. He illustrates this with an example from dolphins, creatures that exhibit belief, correction of belief, and coordinated social behavior well before anything we'd call language. His point isn't that dolphins have grammar and syntax, it's that they have purposeful, intelligent agency that doesn't require a language to exist. Language lets us reflect on and redirect ends that we already have. Reflective rationality, in other words, is a development in our experience. So in a digital parallel, I want you to hold on onto this for the rest of the talk. Digital agency requires a prior scaffolding as well, of the code, of the standards, of the protocols, and maintenance of these websites that no individual user creates. We inherit the environment that we act in as agents. We don't originate it. And if the myth of a fully autonomous rational agent collapses under this continuity thesis, the myth of the fully autonomous digital user also collapses for the same reasons. So this is the philosophical foundation, and then part two is where I try to bring it to the ground and to actual mechanics of what happens when someone opens their phone or a laptop. So the scaffolding of digital agency. Before a single click happens, an enormous amount of scaffolding is already in place, and almost none of it was built by the person who is going through the web application or the web page. There are standards, semantic HTML, ARIA rules, captioning specifications, and then the committees that maintain them. There are user agents, there are browsers, plugins, media players, assistive technology software. Now we can bring AI agents into the mix. There's infrastructure, bandwidth, hardware, electrical grids, and yes, metered connections and outdated devices that we might still have. There's also invisible labor. As we've mentioned, engineers, testers, accessibility specialists, and designers who implement things like keyboard navigation, usually without a user ever knowing who built the website or experience. So digital agency, in other words, is mediated. It is mediated experience. The competent user we imagine acting freely and independently online is actually the product of prior networks of design, maintenance, and shared standards they never see and didn't build. So I find this the most philosophically interesting in the whole presentation. Assistive technologies don't introduce dependence into digital experience. They reveal a dependence that was already there for everyone all along. So a blind person using a screen reader or a braille refresh display technology doesn't see a web page that we see. They see something that is parsed through via structured markup. It navigates ARIA rules and interprets heading hierarchies and turns semantic structure in the code into speech that the blind user could hear. What a sighted user experiences simply a web page was the whole time dependent on standards compliance and semantic labeling by the person programming it. It just never became visible as a dependency because the sighted user's needs happen to already be met by default. Captions work in a similar way. Audio has to be transcribed, synchronized, and encoded, rendered according to shared standards, and that requirement doesn't appear from hearing users. It's just invisible to them. Keyboard navigation is maybe the clearest case of all. Without a proper tab order, focus indicators, and logical paths, a user simply cannot act. So the tools we build for people whose need is most visible end up disclosing a truth about every user. We are always dependent digital agents. Accessibility just makes explicit what mediation already meant. So practitioners in this space use a set of lenses as a design discipline. So for a visual lens, we might ask, what if this user can't rely on sight? A motor lens. What if they can't use a mouse? A cognitive lens. What if they process information differently or in a distracting environment? Run any interface through these lenses, and unlabeled buttons, hover-only menus, and dense, unstructured text blocks stop looking neutral. They look like design choices, because they are. And these needs aren't a fixed subpopulation. They're permanent for some users, temporary for others, and purely situational for the rest of us. So think of a parent navigating one-handed holding a child. She might not have the use of her arm anymore, so she's temporarily disabled by that event. And that happens in several other cases. If you're trying to go on your computer while talking on the phone, you're probably going to have a little bit of a problem. So God forbid you're on a web page with heavily dense text and you're trying to find a way to check out. If you're on your phone, you're already kind of distracted. If you have a cognitive deficiency, then we have to think about how we should structure our content so it's simple, it's very clear to maneuver, and this applies to the whole spectrum of disability. So I don't want to leave you with the impression that this resolves neatly, because it doesn't. There's something called an accessibility paradox. That happens when something you do for accessibility could create an accessibility problem for someone else. So detailed alternative text could help screen reader users, but it could overwhelm someone with cognitive processing difference if it's not an adjustable measure. Auto-generated captions could help deaf and hard of hearing users, but may distract someone with attention-related disabilities. So the paradox doesn't mean accessibility work is misguided. It means that human variability is irreducible, and there's no final neutral design standpoint to stand on. Accessibility isn't a box that you check once. It's an ongoing moral practice, one that demands attentiveness and humility rather than an expectation for a finished solution. So if that's the philosophical foundation and the mechanical foundation, what does it actually look like in practice? That is where we have our final point. Just generosity. So MacIntyre, in his Dependent Rational Animals account, warns us that our conventional names for the virtues, such as generosity and justice, aren't quite adequate here on their own. You can be generous without being just, and you can be just without being generous. So he reaches for a Lakota term, wankantagnaka, to name a virtue that integrates both. A generosity I owe to all who also owe it to me. Because I owe it, failing to exhibit it is a failure of justice. Because what's owed is uncalculated giving, failing to exhibit it is also a failure of generosity. So think about what this means for the stranger online. The screen reader user encountering your site for the first time, the deaf learner relying on your captions, and the motor impaired user tabbing through your interface. Their need is constitutive of the very community your digital system claims to serve. And MacIntyre is quite blunt about a virtuous response looks like. Finding in someone's need a sufficient reason to act without requiring further justification. To demand that justification, to ask, but does accommodating them help our market share, is itself, in his words, a sign of defective virtue. That's a generally different foundation for accessibility work that many organizations operate on. Many operate on market share, reputation, competitive advantage, and those are what MacIntyre could call external goods. They might follow, but that's not why the work is owed. And then I would like to discuss two more virtues, and then we'll turn to the common good at the end.
We're running out of time.
Okay.
Even though we only have 2 papers, let's keep each within 30 minutes. The paper and conversation within 30 minutes, and then we can have the extra time to mess with.
Okay. I'll rush through this. So first, truthfulness. MacIntyre situates it inside relationships of accountability. We owe others elementary truthfulness in our account so they can learn from us and from them. Second, a term I want to credit carefully because it comes from an outside Western philosophical tradition, is kuleana. So kuleana is a native Hawaiian concept that Ivan Urabazane brings into design work. It names an inseparable pairing of privilege and responsibility, a right you hold and a duty you owe at once. So MacIntyrean ideas come in these virtues, and together I also bring in Shannon Value's techno-moral virtues, which include care, honesty, and justice. They're specifically dependent form. Value gestures towards this territory in a footnote referencing dependent rational animals. So, very close to finishing. But if I bring Taylor back into the argument, in his Politics of Recognition, Taylor argues that our identity is partly shaped by recognition or its absence. That non-recognition or misrecognition could inflict real harm, imprisoning someone in a false, distorted, reduced picture of themselves. So digital environments are, in Taylor's exact sense, webs of interlocution, and they mirror identity back to users constantly. A system that renders someone unable to act isn't neutral. It reflects back a diminished picture of who's allowed to fully participate. So that's misrecognition enacted through an interface rather than a conversation. But it's the same harm that Taylor mentions. And this is where MacIntyre's account of the common good closes the loop. He argues that flourishing of a community's most dependent members is an important index of flourishing of the whole community. Applied here, the extent to which most dependent users of a digital system can participate meaningfully is a real test of whether that digital community is flourishing at all. This is the conclusion, the final slide. So let me close with a phrase that I built this talk around. Taylor describes a certain kind of moral work as retrieval, restoring something to its proper background of practical benevolence after it's drifted into instrumental domination. I want to suggest that digital accessibility is this kind of retrieval work. Valor gave us the techno-moral virtues we need to live well with technology. What I've tried to show today is that those virtues applied to disability and dependence turn out to be the virtues of acknowledged dependence as discussed in Dependent Rational Animals. So here's where I'll leave the argument. Digital accessibility is a disciplined communal practice of acknowledged dependence. The flourishing of the most dependent user is the index of the flourishing of the whole digital community. And when we actually design accessibility, not as compliance or charity, but as one kantanaka, as kuleana, as truthfulness about what we show each other, we retrieve technology from instrumental dominance and put it back to where it belongs, inside a shared human good. Thank you for your time.
Now I think we have, if we want to stay on schedule, so that if anybody, does anybody here intend to go to a different paper, a different session? No? Okay. Well, then we can be a little loose. Let's take 5-10 minutes for discussion. And once we go through the second paper, we have some work we really need to do together.
What or who is the unit of concern and of intelligibility when it comes to digital access? What I mean is that I don't have access, for example, to understanding, even beginning to understand how the